The Great Reset. Well, you might recognize the phrase from the now infamous report published by Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, a vision that would mean that we all lose our freedoms, that we live in ultimate authoritarianism. But what if I told you that there's another Great Reset, and that this one is actually a good one? The Great Reset, Restoring Member States' Sovereignty in the European Union, is a report written, a scholarly political counteroffensive, presenting two scenarios to reform the European Union, with one fundamental aim: to restore sovereignty to its rightful place, the nation states. Once envisioned as a project of peaceful economic collaboration between sovereign nations and the EU, morphed into a supranational leviathan. So, today, key decisions are not made by elected national parliaments, but by unelected technocrats in Brussels. And the European Commission, though lacking any democratic legitimacy or clear mandate, is exercising absolute authoritarianism, unchecked, unchallenged, and unaccountable. So it's very clear that the EU is in a desperate need of a great reset. And I'm very happy to announce that with us today is Rodrigo Ballester. He is the head of the European states at the MCC in Budapest, and he's also one of the authors of the Great Reset. Mr. Ballester, I'm very happy that you could join today us here at Fix.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for welcoming me.
Well, the Great Reset, a bit of a controversial title. What does the Great Reset mean for you? What would that look like?
Well, first of all, we let me admit that we were a bit naughty, in choosing the title, and of course, we wanted to have this ironic reference to the book of Klaus Schwab, which is, like a book I really disagree with, and a concept of philosophy, and so we wanted to be naughty and to be ironic. But at the end of the day, this title also reflects what is really very much needed in the European Union. I think we came to a point where the European Union either reforms dramatically, in a drastic way, or dies. And so that's why this report also has a second scenario, which is precisely that if we don't implement the first, then get ready for the second. And the second is to start from scratch an intergovernmental cooperation among countries. And so we often speak about the reform of the European Union. It's something that in Brussels, it's a very common discussion. The problem is that whenever they discuss that, they always go in one direction, which is whether you like it or not, whatever the voters say, we always get more Europe, more centralization, more federalization. And wait a minute, not everything is going very well in the European Union lately. Look at migration, for example. Since we gave up those competences 25 years ago, it's probably not the right level, to manage migration properly. And still no one is asking, why don't we get it back? And the same thing applies with the whole European Union, is that I'm personally not in favor of dismantling it. I don't want the scenario B, but I do want the scenario A, which is again, a deep reform. There's not only one way of looking at the European Union. For example, in our point of view, we believe that it got carried away in the last 30 years, and that we should put back the key concept of the European Union and the heart of it, which is the national sovereignty of member states. We have to make sure that the member states become again the shareholders of the European Union, not the servants.
Yeah, as you said, there's two scenarios, right? The first one is reform the EU from within, which means that we go back to the EU how it was originally intended to be, meaning that we are collaborating as sovereign nation states, that decisions are being made as close by the national parliaments as possible, and it's really focusing more on economical collaboration than as the supranational political, social collaboration as we're seeing it currently. The second one, as you mentioned, is of course saying, okay, we're going to get rid of all the European institutions, we're going to have a clean state, and then we're going to start over again. Well, So when I read your report, I thought to myself, how likely is this going to happen? To say we're going to abolish the European Commission? Because let's face it, these people that are working for the European Commission, they've been living this wonderful life, For decades, they were able to do whatever they wanted. There was no checks and balances. Nobody was holding them accountable. They are living this lavish lifestyle. They're being paid well. They're building up a nice pension. Realistically, the life that they have, they're not going to be willing to give that up. Also, we see the European Commission, or like the EU as it is currently in this current state, is so powerful that it would be very hard even to get rid of all these EU institutions. How do you see this? Which one of the two scenarios do you think is more likely to actually happen?
I think it's the first scenario. And clearly, this is what I would advocate for. Again, I don't want the EU to disappear. I still think that the EU, in some ways, is working decently. I still think that at the scale of history is rather a good invention than a bad one. I also think that citizens are attached to some of their, freedom to move, for example, or I also think that the internal market works decently well. So personally, I'm not advocating for some scenario B. I only want to have it there in case scenario A is not implemented. And then, what if we have a reform of the treaties tomorrow? What would be the outcome? First of all, we know already because there is a reform of the treaties that is already on the table of the member states. It has been voted by the European Parliament in November 2023. And this reform proposes like a drastic federalization, centralization of the European Union, more powers for Brussels, less competences for member states, almost nothing is left. And so they're really proposing like a European superstate. No one knows about it. And our report is a response to this concrete report voted by the European Parliament that behind the back of 99.9% of the citizens already cooked a reform that goes into that direction. And so if we have a serious reform of the treaties, like a serious process, again, I don't think that that the decision makers are going to implement our scenario A, our first scenario point by point. And so it's true that the mood in Brussels is, again, whenever we have problems, let's give more competences to the European Union. That's the mood of the Parliament, of course. This is the mood of the Commission. This is the worrying part, the mood of most of the member states. So let's not be naive. Our report has now fewer chances today of being implemented than a federalist report. This being said, the majority of the citizens probably agree with more with our approach than with the federalist approach. And now voters are expressing their opinions as well. Some governments are changing. And again, if tomorrow, let's say there is a reform of the treaties and half of the ideas of the great report are implemented by the decision makers, I think that will be already a great victory, and that will be the beginning of a serious reform of the European Union that might end up saving this European Union. But let's face it, if the European Union doesn't change in the next 5 years, I think that indeed, only the scenario B will be the most realistic one, and so the EU will be shooting itself in the foot.
Well, 5 years, I think you're pretty optimistic. I think you're thinking the EU is very viable at this point. But if you would have to say between 0 and 100%, how high do you think the chance is that we could actually still reform the EU? Can we have hope? Is there hope for the people, like daily people like you, like me, and the people watching this?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it's about core principles. It's not just sovereignty, it's not just a word. It's about getting back our our freedoms.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that decisions that are being made in Brussels are reflecting the needs and um, and the needs of the people.
I think there is a 50-50 scenario. See, the chances of saving the European Union through a real reform, it's basically 50%. That might be optimistic for some, might be also very pessimistic for others. I still think that indeed there is a chance to save the European Union because in some ways, again, I know it by heart. I worked there 15 years. There are some interesting policies like the internal market that absolutely no one wants to get rid of. And that's enough as well, if you focus on that, to save it and to keep it working the way it was working before the Maastricht Treaty 30 years ago. The problems of the European Union come from this treaty, the Maastricht Treaty. But before that, the average satisfaction was rather high, both among citizens and among member states. We have to come back to that. And also, if the member states, so the national governments, wake up and are ready to defend their prerogatives and their interests again, that will balance the European Union, that will allow for such a reform, and then indeed will save the European Union on the premises that too much integration is killing the integration, and less integration actually might save the European integration.
Speaking about less integration, you were as one of the reforms that you advocated for is, as I said, the abolishment of the EU institutions, and then probably the most people think European Commission or whatever. But you were also mentioning the European Court of Justice. Why would it be crucial to also get rid of the European Court of Justice?
Yes, well, we are not advocating for an abolition in the scenario A. We are rather advocating for a drastic reform. And if I have to summarize the reform that we suggest in one sentence, it will be to put the European Council, which is the place, the institution where the big national bosses gather, the prime ministers and the heads of government, and so heads of state and government gather. It should be the cornerstone of this new European Union. And this institution should be above anyone else, above the Commission, above the Parliament, and above the European Court of Justice. So we are not proposing to abolish the European Commission. We just want the European Commission to be a technical secretariat under the political power of the member states. We don't want to abolish the European Parliament, but we would like it to be an hybrid assembly of some elected members, directly elected members, but some others, coming from the national parliaments, because in national parliaments, they know much better about the reality of the citizens. And speaking about the European Court of Justice, indeed, this is an institution that today is also part of the problem. Why? First, because it is too lonely. No one is controlling. No one controls it. It's the only court in Europe, the only one that is not subject to the European Convention of Human Rights. So you cannot appeal, basically, their decisions when it comes to very important human rights problems. I'm not a big fan of the European Court of Human Rights, neither. I'm absolutely not a big fan of them. But it's very telling that this European Court of Justice, that is teaching lessons to everyone on the rule of law, decided on its own not to be part of the European Convention of Human Rights. Also, this court has the tendency, not to judge according to what is written, but according to, the general objective of federalism. This is what we call in law a theological interpretation. It means that you interpret the text according to one objective. And this objective is more Europe, more Europe, and more Europe. And again, that's unfair, and this is not their role. And also, I think that this court, that's my third point, has a huge conflict of interests. And so the way we nominate the judges must change radically. I give you some examples. The current German judge used to be the head of cabinet of President Barroso. He also used to be a director general in the European Commission. I'm not questioning his probity and his integrity. I'm just saying that his mere position there is a huge conflict of interest, because you cannot judge on topics that are run by your ex-colleagues. It's impossible, and they do it. And this is the court that claims that now, this is the European Union, that claims that Hungary, for example, has enough conflict of interest in the governance of their universities to kick out 200,000 Hungarian students from Erasmus. Are they kidding us or what? And so they are, you have huge problems of the rule of law in the European Union, and they are still teaching lessons to the member states. This is something I cannot swallow. So indeed, I think that the European Court of Justice should be an administrative court with less powers, less prerogatives. They shouldn't decide, for example, on conflict of competences within nations, and they should be under the, hierarchically under the European Council, so the member states. They shouldn't be at the same level.
So I think beyond what you're proposing, because it's not just an institutional problem that we're facing, I think it is also a problem of having faith in our institutions, having faith in our politicians, and that would be something, of course, very hard to actually, that would be even more difficult because, like you, for example, Ursula von der Leyen, right? This backdoor deal that she made, she was giving zero transparency. It was even ruled by the court that she would have to go transparent with those messages. We'll never probably ever get to see them. At the same time, she is surviving three motions of no confidence, and she gets away with it. So people are losing their faith, their trust in these institutions, and if you don't have the trust of the people, it's you actually don't have any legitimacy. How can we overcome that, even if we will go into the reforms as you proposed?
Again, by giving more powers to the people who really represent European citizens, and those persons are the heads of government and heads of state. Those persons are the national ministers. So we have to make sure that the European Union, the center of gravity relies on the member states and their representatives and no one else. Because what you're saying is very true. The European Parliament is directly elected, but who knows about them? And what de facto legitimacy do they have? I mean, it's not enough that they are elected with 50% of turnout every 5 years. That doesn't make them totally legitimate. And then when we also see like the decisions they take and also like how much they are leaning to the left when actually the continent is leaning to the right, it also shows that this Parliament is not really representing the interests and the views of the vast majority of the European member states. I mean, the further you go from the citizens you represent, and here you have quite a few like levels between the citizen and the members of the European Parliament, then indeed like they lose their legitimacy and their as you already said in your question. So indeed, it's important again to bring back the European Union closer to the level of the citizens. And it's not about reforming the European Union only, it's simply about giving more power to the nations. I mean, I live in Hungary. The Hungarian government has a strong legitimacy. And so its voice should prevail in Brussels, and the voice of their colleagues as well, above the voice of the court, the voice of the Commission, and the voice of the European Parliament. I think this is a pretty straightforward manner to, again, make sure that the EU is closer to the European citizens. Another way as well is like, again, you mentioned it already, is the total lack of accountability of the European Union. I mean, it's very shocking to see that the same government von der Leyen from the last 5 years who literally proposed the Green Deal, proposed like this suffocating bureaucracy on member states, proposed the European Pact on Migration, now is backtracking. Basically, where they said white, now they are saying black, and as if it was normal. No, I'm sorry, in politics, when you committed mistakes of that caliber, of that size, you just leave. This is called accountability. You push some initiatives, you cannot simply backtracking them because they were wrong. You need to pay a political price for that. This is one of the biggest rules of democracy, is called accountability. And indeed, this is something that doesn't exist in the European Union. And so can you hold European leaders accountable? It's very difficult. So give back the power to the national leaders so that their national citizens can hold them accountable for the decisions they take in Brussels. This is, I think, how we should work.
Imagine we will be able to manage all of these reforms as you have proposed. We bring back the sovereignty to the member states. There is total transparency. We're able to hold these politicians accountable for the decisions that they're making. We will live in a state of democracy and also within the EU as it was first intended to be. How do we, and at the end of the day, the question is also, I think, not just how can we reform the EU, but also how do we make sure that it is sustainable so that it is able to function even for the years to come in the future? Because you cannot keep changing a system. At one point, it has to be able to just function and work. There will still be people that still will have this deep desire of further integration, of federalization, of centralization. How do we assure that even if we succeed to have these reforms, there will not be any other opportunities for the institute to create an overreaching supranational institution as they have managed this time?
Look, and I really believe in democracy. If one day the vast majority of the European citizens wish to become a federation, even if I disagree with them, I have to swallow this decision. This is the problem is that today the European Union is heading in a direction that is not the direction of the vast majority of the member states, and not it doesn't represent the will of the majority of the European citizens. This is the main problem. And here, I think in your question as well, you are addressing the problem of the deep state.
Yeah.
The deep state of the European institutions, which is very much there, but also the deep state of the national bureaucracies. Because one of the biggest problems today is that member states became very docile to Brussels. The huge majority of member states are happy to be shepherded by the Commission. That shouldn't happen. They're very happy to not to defend their prerogatives or to give them away. When they go to Brussels, normally member states are supposed to defend their position. This is also part of the big balance of powers in the European Union. And today, instead of behaving like normal member states, they behave like little ships, like docile ships. And again, this is one of the problems today. And so what am I saying here? That the national administrations, the deep state of the national administration, are also guilty for that. I mean, they do not represent the will of their own citizens. And today it seems that the national bureaucracies have been also captured by this very federalist way of thinking, this federalist philosophy, to the detriment of their own citizens. So we cannot put the blame only on the EU. I think also the member states, how they are represented in Brussels, is very much part of the problem as well. And so the deep state at national level, the deep state at the European level, and when we speak about the deep state at European level, one of the things we propose in the report as well is to limit the salaries. I think this is a very important step as well. It's not very technical. It's not a legal debate. But when people are overpaid, if you combine that with a lack of accountability, you do create a caste of mandarins that believe that they are, beyond good and evil, and that their decisions are the only ones that can be taken and should be imposed top down. And this is also one of the problems of the European Union.
Well, I'm very doubtful that would ever happen, but one can always hope. I really want to encourage everyone that has been watching to read the report for themselves and let us know in a comment what you think. I'll make sure to enlist the link to the report down in the subscription. But I want to thank you very much, Mr. Ballester, for first and foremost the wonderful work that you're doing, but also really for making the time and coming on the show and explaining your vision for the future of Europe.
Thanks to you, Mrs. Karoleva. It has been a pleasure, and thanks for reading the report.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.